The war between Ukraine and Russia continues to flare up. In the first days of January, there was a very critical situation on the Ukrainian-Russian battlefield. This week, Ukraine's southern fronts in particular have witnessed dramatic clashes and operations. The sounds of guns, missiles and bombardments continue uninterruptedly at the front. Let's dive right into the hot breaking points that occur on the front lines on the battlefield. We are going to our first stop, Mykolaiv. In this city, which has been quiet for a long time, 6 Iranian-made Shahed 136 unmanned aerial vehicles belonging to the Russian army were destroyed by our defense forces in the first days of the new year. In addition, with the efforts of the National Guard soldiers in this region, one more Shahed 136 kamikaze-type UAV of the Russians was shot down. However, the invading Russian troops continued their steps to disrupt the peace of Mykolaiv. Despite all these defensive actions of our forces, the Moscow army launched attacks on the shorelines of Oshakov in the Mykolaiv region. In this region, our forces managed to thwart these Russian attacks on civilian targets. Fortunately, there were no casualties in Mykolaiv. However, there are still some intelligence reports that the danger of possible attacks by the invading troops will continue in the region. Even in Mykolaiv, one of the quiet settlements in the war, the beginning of the activity signaled that the southern fronts of Ukraine flared up again. Now we move on to Kherson, the other critical front line just south. We have witnessed important situations in this region this week as well. The defense forces of Ukraine confirmed fire damage to personnel and military equipment of the Moscow army in the settlement of Chulakivka in the Kherson region. This week's final Russian casualties on this front line totaled 500 soldiers, both wounded and dead in a single day. The Moscow army was rapidly losing power on this front. On the other hand, the counterattacks carried out by our soldiers along the front line in the southern region in recent days are starting to show their benefits. Our forces continue to repel Russian attempts to attack Ukrainian positions in Kherson Oblast, on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River, and force Russian troops to regroup. Moscow's invading forces maintain significant numbers in southern Ukraine despite deficiencies on the eastern front, and are bringing mobilized Russian reserves to the front lines in Kherson Oblast. It was also claimed that some of the Russian forces on the Crimean Peninsula were trying to deploy to critical positions in Kherson. Was Russia trying to inflame Ukraine's southern front line again and draw the focus of our forces there? However, the fortifications and trench preparations created by the Kiev army in both Kherson and Melitopol, Tokmak, and other front lines in the south of Ukraine seem to be enough to hinder the aims of the invading troops on the fronts in the region. We are going to Berdyansk, the place where the most activity is experienced among the southern front lines of Ukraine, which has turned into a fireplace. In the reports of the resistance activities in Mariupol, which was temporarily occupied by the Russian troops on the coast of the Azov Sea, it was stated that the Russians moved their fortifications to Berdyansk and their ammunition to Donetsk. Our Ukrainian armed forces dealt a heavy blow to the preparations of the invading Russian army between the Berdyansk and Mariupol line. The Kiev army carried out simultaneous striking attacks on the cities of Tarasivka, Basan, Polohi, Berdyansk and Tokmak yesterday. As a result of these attacks, the Ukrainian armed forces killed more than 175 Russian soldiers in these areas and destroyed a Russian ammunition depot and 12 pieces of weapons and military equipment. According to the latest hot details from these southern cities, where explosions and attacks took place, the heaviest damage occurred in Berdyansk. Even now, the attacks of the Ukrainian forces still continue in the city. The explosion of a large Russian ammunition depot in Berdyansk, due to the attacks of the Kiev soldiers, multiplied the losses of Moscow. In addition, it is currently unknown whether the planned shipment of weapons and other military equipment was carried out by the Russian forces between the Berdyansk and Mariupol line. These Russian military resources were to be distributed, as we have mentioned, from Berdyansk first to Mariupol, and from there to the eastern fronts of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk. But according to some intelligence reports, these Russian military equipment did not materialize because of Ukraine's massive and effective attacks on Berdyansk. Berdyansk is a region isolated from the concentration of the front in the south, and the firing range of our land forces cannot reach it. However, our brave army reached the rear of the Russian invading troops with a very effective operation and managed to cut the main logistics line of the invaders from the inside, Putin's invading army was shot in the back. They did not expect such a powerful attack. In addition, our armed forces hit the main support points behind the invading Russian army in Kherson, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Luhansk, inflicting the heaviest losses on Moscow. The fact that Moscow could not carry out this shipment has greatly affected the situation on Ukraine's eastern front at the moment. Last week, Russian troops attempted to launch a major attack on Bakhmut, and the invading troops even advanced towards the city center. However, our army repulsed the Russians by sending high-mass troops, Azov Regiment, and the most elite troops to the region. As of today, Russian troops had to retreat 10 kilometers from the front line a week ago. Thousands of Russian invaders were destroyed in the process. Many of them were members of the Wagner Group or Kadyrov's Chechen Kadyrov soldiers. At the moment, our Ukrainian armed forces continues the two-way offensive operations from the northeast and southeast directions of Bakhmut, but the latest situation there and other eastern fronts is in favor of the Ukrainian forces. The main factor underlying this is Russia's inability to provide any additional military support to the cities of Donetsk and Bakhmut at the moment. For in the city of Bakhmut, the main centers of conflict seem to be the city's southern and northern front lines. On the southern line of Bakhmut, on the side of Chernivtsi, Ukrainian forces took a great deal of control of the situation. If we look at the northern line of Bakhmut city, the military support from the Russian-dominated Soledar and Vesele is insufficient. In addition, the tension and exacerbation on the eastern fronts of Ukraine increased considerably, with the Russian troops' defense lines in Crimea, located in the north of these two cities, split by 4 kilometers by the Kiev forces. Especially the Russian forces on the Crimea and Severodonetsk front lines currently do not even have a second alternative, because, with the striking counterattacks of the Ukrainian forces and partisan groups in Svatova, north of Crimea, the dominance of this front line seems to be in the hands of Kiev for the moment. The invading troops trapped in Crimea seem to have no chance of escaping from the north. In the south of Crimea, the Russian forces in Dubrova and Bilohorivka can hardly affect the situation. The reason for this situation is that these two cities are located in the north of Bakhmut and are considered as the threats of the Ukrainian forces to this front line. In this region, the Russians are unsure of the steps they take, as they do not have a good grasp of the details of Ukraine's preparations and possible attacks. In short, in the following days, we can witness the attacks of the forces of the Kiev army, both on the Crimea front line and in the southern directions of Bakhmut. So how did the eastern fronts of Ukraine suddenly become so complex? How did the Kiev forces become so influential in Donetsk and Luhansk after the new year? The answer to these questions is actually based on the situations that happened a few days before and a few days after 2023. But the attacks that took place in late December are the benchmark. You may remember that the Ukrainian Air Force targeted Russian military bases with unmanned aerial vehicles towards the end of December, especially after the attacks on the Engels Air Base and the Ryazan military base in the Saratov region. The Moscow administration placed the air defense systems on Ukraine's eastern front at strategic points near the capital Moscow, because the attack intelligence of the Ukrainian Air Force against Moscow forced the Russians to take this step. As a result, Ukraine's eastern front, as well as regions in Donetsk, Bakhmut and Luhansk, became a much more open target for attacks by the Kiev army. You can see a similar situation on the southern fronts of Ukraine. The current threats of attacks by Kiev forces on the Crimean Peninsula and its surroundings are seriously affecting Moscow. In order to protect the peninsula, Russia has to bypass some of the southern fronts of Ukraine. What the Russians, who are under pressure from both sides, will do is uncertain at the moment. Maybe in the future, the situation will get much worse for Moscow. We will see this together. Thank you for watching us.